In the latest SBS, Oda revealed Zoro's official family tree, but while you may have already seen it floating online, what you may have missed is the real meaning of the etymology of Zoro's family members, the secrets that the meanings of those names hold, and how that connects with the lore of the Wano country, and even gives us a major hint about the identity of the three ancient weapons, believe it or not. This may sound confusing, but allow me to explain it for you. So for starters, here's the official family tree provided by Oda and translated by me. As it was explained in a previous SBS, Shimotsuki Kozaburo was a swordsmith from the Wano country who crafted both the blades Wado Ichimonji and Enma. Enma was gifted to a young Oden for his 4th anniversary, whereas Kozaburo kept the Wado Ichimonji with himself. Then 55 years ago, he illegally left Wano to set sail, joining a group of a total of 25 people to see the outside world. Among those people was Shimotsuki Furiko, the older sister of Shimotsuki Ushimaru, these being the former daimyo of Ringo and the guy who met a young Yamato and called himself so-and-so, if you remember him. This ship of 25 people sailing from Wano arrived in the East Blue, and they liberated a group of people there that had their village ravaged by bandits. 10 of the 25 people from that expedition decided to stay behind and settle a home in that place, where they rebuilt the village anew, this time under the name of Shimotsuki Village. This group included Kozaburo and Furiko, who fell in love with 2 of the locals. Kozaburo fell in love with a girl from the town and gave birth to Shimotsuki Koshiro, who in turn gave birth to Shimotsuki Kuina, Zoro's childhood friend. The Wano Ichimonji was passed down all the way to Kuina and was then given to Zoro and is now one of his swords. Meanwhile, Ushimaru's sister Furiko fell in love with a local swordsman from the village called Roronoa Pin Zoro. The two gave birth to Roronoa Arashi, who then fell in love with a young girl called Tera, who was the daughter of thieving bandits. The two, of course, would end up giving birth to Roronoa Zoro, but his father Arashi would die in a battle against pirates, and his mother Tera would pass away due to illness, leaving Zoro orphan and to be raised by the people of the village instead, which then ties directly into his flashback from Shell's Town. So fundamentally, this explains why Ushimaru was compared as being similar to Zoro, because the two were actually related, with Ushimaru being Zoro's great uncle. And since Ushimaru was a confirmed descendant of the legendary samurai Shimotsuki Ryuma, then that makes Furiko, and by extent Zoro himself, direct descendants of Ryuma as well, whereas Kozaburo and by extent Kuina, as well as others like Shimotsuki Yasuye, are distant relatives of Zoro, being part of the same clan but not immediate family. I also find it interesting that only 10 of the members of this expedition of 25 stayed behind at Shimotsuki village, and makes me wonder if some of the other 15 included Shimotsuki who settled elsewhere in the East Blue. This could potentially finally explain the long-standing mystery of Tashigi and Kuina's resemblance, as Tashigi could be the grandkid of a close relative of Kozaburo. It would explain why she's so obsessed with swords if she came from a swordsmith family, and would explain her similarities with Kuina as they'd be close relatives. But regardless, the most interesting part of this whole family tree is the etymologies of the name of each of the characters. On the Roronoa side, things get a lot more interesting as they're all connected in one way to another to traditional Japanese dice gambling. Pin Zoro refers to rolling doubles on a dice, what we call in English snake eyes, whereas Arashi refers to rolling triple dices, though it also more literally translates to the Japanese word for storm. Meanwhile, Furiko refers to the person in charge of rolling dices for gambling, whereas Tera could be derived from terasen, the fee required to partake in a gambling house. It's quite likely that Zoro got his name from his grandfather, which would quite literally simply translate his name to pair, as Pinzoro means a pair of ones, the term for rolling a 2 on a dice. This theme of gambling ties with the whole Japanese Wano heritage, but it perhaps could also relate to the theme with Zoro testing his own luck. This is interesting in and of itself, but what is a lot more fascinating is the name used for Zoro's mother, Tera, because Tera can also refer to the earth itself, and I find this particularly interesting as Sanji's own mother was instead called Sora, which is the Japanese word for sky. Add Jinbei, who is the first son of the sea, and suddenly all three commanders in Luffy's crew are connected to the Trinity of Planes. This fits even further as Sanji is someone who often fights in the sky through skywalk, Jinbei fights in the water with fishman karate, and Zoro referred to himself as the King of Hell, or in other words, the underworld, the earth below. The Trinity of Planes is a concept from Greek mythology and philosophy that presents the idea that the world is split into three planes. Below lies the underworld where the Hades or Hell resides, ruled by the god Pluton. In the middle are the seas, ruled by the god Poseidon, and above are the skies, ruled by the god Uranus. Hearing this should suddenly make things a lot more apparent, as these three gods are the ones the three ancient weapons in One Piece were named after. This ties into the bigger cosmology of the One Piece pantheon of gods we've talked about before. The cosmology of gods of our planetary system is divided into two. On one hand, due to a lack of technology to spot further planets in ancient times, it was believed the Earth was surrounded by 5 elder planets, or Gorosei in Japanese. So in this case, this old system represents the mother of nature Earth, which could be Imu-sama, and the 5 Gorosei that surround it. But modern science instead proves that the planets revolve around the sun, aka the sun god Nika, and that these also include the planets revolving around the sun, named after the Trinity of Planes, Pluton, Poseidon, and Uranus. Do you see the parallel? This naming system is also reflected in the Japanese names for the planets, as the 5 elder stars are named after the 5 elements of Eastern belief, whereas the 3 furthest planets are named after the Greek planes, being literally called in Japanese the Sky King Planet, Sea King Planet, and Underworld or Hell King Planet. This is fitting because, as we've seen, Shirahoshi is the commander of all Sea Kings, and it would explain why Zoro referred to himself as the King of Hell, the Underworld King, literally Pluton. So what if this is meant to be an intentional parallel, and is Oda's way of indicating that perhaps in the Void Century, the human counterparts to the 3 ancient weapons were actually the 3 commanders of Joy Boy's pirate crew, with now Luffy's own 3 commanders symbolically reflecting that similar trinity, all part of a twist of fate. And when you think about it, this actually goes a lot deeper because it ties with the heritage of each respective crew member. Jinbei is from Fishman Island, which is where Poseidon currently resides, whereas Zoro is now confirmed to be from Wano, where Pluton also resides. So I wonder if maybe Sanji's own heritage ties in some form to Uranus. I find it unlikely that Uranus was tied to Germa, but maybe there's some part of Sanji and Germa's history we don't still fully know about, or it has something to do with the Vinsmokes being augmented by the bloodline elements, which could potentially tie into those who applied that technology in the Void Century, being the Lunaria of the God Country, who Sanji himself has been often likened to due to his ability to generate flames, so perhaps that's where the connection goes. Which could make sense, as Pluton is found in the underworld beneath Wano, which Zoro ties to, Poseidon is found at the sea at Fishman Island, which Jinbei ties to, and thus Uranus could be somewhere up in the sky, such as for example the top of the Red Line, where the god country of the Lunaria once resided. Perhaps that could even tie into why Imu-sama seems to have such a world-destroying power at the moment. Either way, while we're at it, let's quickly talk about the remaining stuff from this SBS, as you might find some of it interesting. For one, it's the fact that Otama's full name is confirmed to be Kurozumi Tama, making her part of the same clan as Orochi and Kanjuro. Now this isn't actually new, as we already saw the name Kurozumi being written on the graves of her parents, but it's something that you probably lost in translation if you didn't read Japanese, so it's good to have it confirmed directly by Oda as well now. The implications of this are very significant for the narrative, as on one hand it helps shows how cruel Orochi was, that he only cared about himself and was willing to let his clan suffer, but on the other it shows how this cycle of hatred and revenge was broken after Orochi's death, and how the people of Wano are now willing to forgive the Kurozumi and accept them once again. In fact, Oda even goes on to explain in this SBS how Hiyori's comment at the end of the arc was intended for Orochi and Orochi alone, and that they have no intention to persecute other Kurozumi like Tama. This is something that was clearer in the Japanese version and got a bit lost in translation, like I talked about it back in the day, especially if you didn't read the official translation, which also clarified it was meant in the singular. A lot of this confusion among Western readers arose because this scene ties with the concept of Rakugo theater, and the laugh tales of Rakugo theater, which make heavy use of puns and wordplay to deliver powerful messages. But if you're not familiar with the culture, then this bizarre pun might just come off as a really poor attempt at a joke, rather than the culturally meaningful line it is meant to be. Though of course, whether you think the execution was done well enough or not is up to you, but it's good to have official confirmation that the cycle of hatred in Wano will be put to a stop, as the Kurozumi will be forgiven. This is a perfect circular narrative, as Wano started with how much Tama was suffering under the oppression of Orochi, and now the Kurozumi are forgiven to ensure that never happens again. I find it particularly meaningful to mention how Oda here states that this is a problem that is still widespread in many parts of the world, and he specifically tells readers to think for themselves how they think Hiyori and Momonosuke would react if they found out Tama is a Kurozumi. On a similar topic about Wano, Oda also comments on how Chopper was unable to make a medicine that can reverse the effects of smile that make people laugh, claiming that there are some things in the world that we can't do anything about. However, he puts particular emphasis on the fact that Chopper can't do it yet, so perhaps once he's achieved his dream of being able to cure any disease in the world, he could be able to come back and cure the people of Wano. Also, Yamato's least favorite food is spicy food like chili and wasabi. Make of that what you will. Oda also clarifies Sanji's genetic alterations, explaining that the scientific alterations Judge applied on him did have some effect, but were mostly neutralized by the medicine Sora took. These small alterations were enough to give Sanji abnormally high heat resistance, which is why he was able to withstand the heat of Diable Jambe and not burn his leg off, though the way Oda words it makes it sound like Diable Jambe is created through Sanji's own strength, not his genetic alterations. Using the raid suit brought out further latent scientific alterations, which caused Sanji's eyebrow to reverse direction like the other Vinsmokes for a few chapters, though it reversed back again after the fight with Queen. On the topic of if the Straw Hats share their past with each other, Oda comments that if you think about the personalities of the original crew members, Luffy and Zoro don't really talk about their past. Nami, Sanji, and Chopper will talk about their past if asked, and Usopp will talk about his past even if not asked. But since the adult team can tell when he's lying, they instead ask Nami, Sanji, or Chopper for the truth. That said, among the Straw Hats, there are those that aren't interested in the pasts of others. Oda also talks about the way in which he incorporates fanservice into his story, claiming that, ever since I was a child, there's been many manga that feature fanservice scenes, but most of the time it's done against the consent or will of the female characters. So I feel that having females show their sexuality out of their own volition, such as like with Happiness Sponge, is a much needed revolution for the representation of heroines in manga. And finally, Oda talks about the form in which comics exist in the One Piece world, clarifying how they don't exactly have manga, but what are known as illustrated stories, or monogatari in Japanese, which is what Kaido referred to in chapter 1045. Illustrated stories, or monogatari, are a precursor to comics in old Japan that feature panels without speech balloons, instead describing the actions within them in large text boxes. In the One Piece world, it seems they still haven't gotten to the stage of current manga with speech balloons, but it's basically the same thing, just a slightly different format, so just think of them as comics existing in the One Piece world. Oda also presented us with some of the most famous titles that currently exist, such as the Warrior of the Sea Sora, which you might remember having been mentioned several times as the propaganda hero shown in the comic strip of the World Economic Journal, as well as Fardog, Pokémon, Monkey Ball, and Maruko-san. These three former are all of course parodies and references to famous manga that have all inspired Oda, such as Doraemon, though the name is changed to Pocket Pokémon to make him sound like Pokemon, Dragon Ball, and Chibi Maruko-chan. This latter one in specific, whose mangaka was a close friend of Oda and sadly passed away a few years ago, so it's really nice to see him showing tribute this way. This concept may not seem that important right now, but I'm sure you'll one day realize just how crucial this really is to the story, so please keep this last bit in mind. But that's a theory for another day, a story no one yet knows about.